who's here with us to talk about eBird, using eBird and the power of citizen science, right? So what I will do right now is to invite Ivan to welcome, first of all, and thank you for joining us. And yeah, so feel free to take the stage, share your screen, and tell us a little bit or a lot about yourself. And yeah, take it away.
All right. Can you hear me okay, everyone, Faraz?
Yeah, hearing you perfectly.
Yeah,
Great,
all good.
Great. Okay, well, thank you guys. Thanks Faraz and Derek and Learn the Birds for the invitation to do this. I'm really excited, and it's great to see so many people here. So I think we're going to have some fun. Let me go ahead and get rolling with sharing my screen. And just let me know if you see that. Hopefully you do.
Yep, seeing fine.
Great, great. Okay. Well, I'm going to go ahead and stop my video just to save a little bandwidth, and I hope everyone can hear me all right, and we'll get rolling. So again, thanks everybody for being here. We of course are talking about eBird, and I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with it, if not heavy users of eBird. So we'll be talking about the application and the power of citizen science today. So it's pretty exciting. Let's see here. Oops. Why is it not?
Just a quick note, Ivan, not to cut you across before you start, to everyone. As per usual, any questions that you have, just please put them in the chat and we will get to them after Ivan is finished.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you, Faraz. Okay, yeah, so as is probably customary to start these things, a little bit about who you're hearing right now. So I'm Ivan Phillipsen. I am very much a bird lover, a bird enthusiast, and I have miraculously managed to create a career now out of looking at birds, which is pretty awesome. My background is in biology and science. I went to grad school for far too many years, got a master's in biology, PhD in zoology, and then worked for a few years as a biologist after that. And then, you know, kind of did some soul searching and pivoted to a new career, which is what I'm doing now, working as a professional naturalist guide and educator. And so the main two things that occupy my time are first my podcast, which I started about a year ago, The Science of Birds. That's something that I'm very passionate about. I spend a lot of time working on it. I try to get an episode out about once every 2 weeks or so. And yeah, it's something that I find very enjoyable, and I have a great response from my listeners. A lot of people are listening, so that's been really enjoyable. And something I've been doing for about the last 5 or 6 years is I'm also the co-owner of a nature tour business called Wild Latitudes. We're based in Portland, Oregon. That's where I live. But we run tours in various places around the US as well as around the world. I just did a trip to Alaska, and right after that, I did a trip to Iceland. And both were super exciting. It's great to get back out there after all the COVID stuff. And I've got trips to Oaxaca, Mexico coming up, and next year going to Spain and Madagascar, all kinds of exciting places. So I really feel honored to be able to do this kind of work and to show people great birds and experience the world myself and with other people. So that's what occupies my time, keeps me very busy. But what are we talking about today? Today, we are going to, of course, be talking about eBird, and we'll start off by just kind of talking about what it is, make sure we're all on the same page with that, with respect to that. Then we'll talk a bit about the nature or the structure of eBird data. How do you record it, and you know, what does it look like? And then I'm going to talk a little bit about research using eBird data. What kinds of questions could a scientist ask and perhaps answer using eBird data? And I also want to give you a handful of example studies that are very recent. They were published in 2020, you know, showing you how scientists have been using eBird data. Probably some of your own data that you've contributed, which is pretty cool. And then I will finish up by just giving you some tips that are directly from the folks at eBird on how you can be a better citizen scientist, how you can improve the quality of the data that you are submitting to eBird. Now, what are we not talking about today? This is not a tutorial on how to use eBird. As much as I think that would be really fun, and I love talking about eBird, we don't have time to do that today, so I hope that that's not why you're here. If you are, I hope you'll stick around. I think you'll still find this interesting, but there are other resources available for learning how to use eBird. I'm going to guess most of you are pretty hip to using eBird already. So what exactly is eBird? There's different ways we could talk about it. Of course, we could say it's a website or it's an app, but fundamentally, eBird is an online, freely accessible database, a database of bird observations. And it's, of course, a massive database. The data is freely available to scientists, to conservationists, educators, and amateur naturalists, like many of us, birders. So it's this amazing online database. And the goal of eBird, and this was started in 2002, the goal was to bring all this information together in one place, archive it, and allow it to be freely available to scientists and the public. So I think they have achieved that goal and then some. So this is what I imagine where all that those mountains of data end up, or in server rooms. It looks something like this, some kind of science fiction thing. This is just a stock photo from the internet, so this is probably not what it actually looks like, but this is what I imagine. There is a lot of data out there, and eBird is a freely available resource, but you can make donations and things to the Cornell lab, to eBird, to help pay for all of that server space and all the other infrastructure for eBird. Just something to think about if you use it a lot. So I love this image. This map is directly from the eBird website, and it reminds me of something I heard a number of years ago. There are these animals called nematodes, and if you've never heard of nematodes, they're little worms. They're round worms, many of which are microscopic, and they're all over the place. They are incredibly diverse. They live in the soil. They live deep down in the bedrock. They live in the bottom of the ocean, in every tree, plant, animal, and there are dozens of species that are parasites in humans. And what this quote was that I heard years ago was that if you took away all of the matter in the universe, but you left nematodes, that if you looked at Earth, you would still be able to see the outline of all the continents. You'd see the outline of trees, of people. You could tell where the cities were, the roads, because nematodes are so pervasive that that's what you would see. So this is not a map of nematodes. This is a map of eBird observations. eBird has been used so much for so many years by so many people that you could literally see pretty much the outline of all of the landmass on Earth, with the exception of Antarctica, Siberia, a few places like that. It's pretty amazing. And you can see where the cities are and where a number of the highways are, and the ocean routes, right? Those lines through the ocean. So pretty remarkable. Lots and lots of data. So as of this morning, there were 57,384,000 or so checklists that have been submitted to eBird. And those came from almost 700,000 individual people, individual eBirders. And with all of that data, 10,517 bird species have been recorded in eBird. And that's pretty good, given that, as far as we know, there's about 10,563 total species, according to the taxonomy that eBird uses. Now, why eBird doesn't have those remaining few dozen birds, I'm not sure. But still, that's pretty remarkable coverage, both geographically and taxonomically. This map should be familiar to many of you if you use the online interface for eBird. Now, this is different. This is not the actual numbers of observations. This now is the actual diversity of species. This is what we would call a heat map. So the warmer the colors, the more species you have. If you can see that little legend on the left there, that the red is somewhere between 500 and 600 plus species for a given pixel on the map. So right away, you can see where the world's bird diversity is concentrated, and that's pretty remarkable. And you can see, of course, the opposite, where there don't appear to be so many birds. But you also have to keep in mind, when you look at maps like this, is that this is a function of both where the birds are, but also where the people are, where the observers are. So just because we don't see diversity, let's say in Siberia, it doesn't mean there aren't birds there. It just means maybe that people aren't going there and recording their observations. So always something to keep in mind. So we can zoom in on this map and we could see a more fine scale resolution of where the diversity is. Here's the southern part of Africa. You could see, more detail in where the diversity is concentrated, and then moving down into the Cape region, you then start to see these individual hot spots. And those are places where people have recorded multiple observations over the years, many people. And again, it's the warmer the color, the more species. So this is probably all review for many of you, so I don't want to belabor that. Another way that this data can be visualized is we have individual species, right? So this would be Temminck's Targapan. This would be the locations that it has been observed. The darker the purple, the more observations have occurred in that location. So it's a rough approximation of the distribution or the range of the species, which is pretty cool. So you can get right away, you can see where people are seeing these birds. Okay, so eBird is arguably the world's largest citizen science project. As I said, 700,000 people, many millions of observations. It's been going since 2002. It's remarkable. How have the people at eBird been able to get this kind of participation? Well, they started off with an advantage because birders, crazy people like us, tend to make lists. And we've been doing that for probably hundreds of years, writing down the birds we see in a particular location on a particular date. And so that was already there. There was that culture. And over the years, as birding has become more popular, and of course, the internet has facilitated a lot of this, the folks at eBird have figured out ways to incentivize people to become even more involved and to contribute even more data, which is awesome. So for example, there are these monthly challenges now. So this is from the eBird homepage. You have these, eBirder of the month challenges, where if you submit an eBird checklist every day of that month, then you go into a drawing, and if you're lucky, you win something like a pair of Zeiss binoculars. You can also, submit checklists within a given month for drawings, like a free course through the Cornell lab. And, you can get featured as the eBirder of the month and become famous and enjoy all of the benefits that come with being famous. Also, you can become famous another way, which is in your particular region or whatever particular region you do a lot of birding, you can become one of the top 100 eBirders. And in this case, this is in Arizona. And so you see that the person there, Gary Rosenberg, at the top, has seen 519 species in the state of Arizona, which is pretty remarkable. You see this other guy there with the yellow bar above Gary, Ivan Phillipsen, that's me. I have seen 14 species in the state of Arizona. So I am ranked at 21,608. So I have a lot of work to do if I want to be in the top 100. I am going to Arizona with my wife in about a week for a road trip, and we're going to do a lot of birding. So hopefully I will move up a few ranks there. Another way that eBird incentivizes people and gets lots of data is through the Global Big Day. This is something that's been going on for a number of years now, primarily in the spring, but they also have a fall activity. And this is a really fun thing where you go out for a 24-hour period and record as many birds as you can, get as many checklists as you can. Some people do it as teams, some as individuals. And every time they've done this, they've broken records for the number of species of birds observed on a single day around the world, as well as for the number of checklists and participants, things like that. So this is a way to get a massive amount of data in a short amount of time, and people really get into this kind of thing. So here's how it's been going. This is as of 2020. You can see the growth in the number of observations. So those are like individual species seen on a checklist, and that's in blue. And then you can see the increase in the number of checklists in orange. And you see that there's, this almost exponential growth now in how that's going. So it's pretty amazing. Yeah, and you can see there's kind of a cyclic nature, right? Probably the spikes are in the spring when in the northern hemisphere when there's more birds to see for people in the north. Okay, so moving on now to talking about the nature or the structure of eBird data. So let's just walk through kind of how you record eBird data. This is, again, not a tutorial, but just, just as a way of thinking about the data. So these are some screenshots from my phone. I use an Android, and you want to start a checklist, and you see that little record track button, and it's set to on by default. If you try to turn it off, you get this. The app says, "We strongly recommend using your device GPS to record your birding track. Your distance traveled will be more accurate for your personal records as well as research and conservation." So they're trying to discourage you from turning that off. You can still turn it off. I turn it off sometimes if I'm just, stationary for an hour or something, sitting in one spot. But in general, they want you to use that. So then you go in and you do your thing. You record all of the species you're seeing, and you can record either just presence or absence. You can just put a check or an X. Yes, the species was there. Or you can put in the actual number of individuals you saw, either specifically or as an estimate. And we'll talk about why you should probably do that as much as possible a little later. And then there's location. Your phone has GPS, so it knows where you are, typically, most of the time. And you can put in your specific exact location, and that may or may not correspond to a local hotspot. Or you can select the nearest hotspot if you want. And of course, if you're tracking, you'll have your location being recorded that way. And then towards the end, just before you're about to submit this thing, you tell the app how many observers there were, whether there was one or more, how long you were there if it's not automatically tracking that. And then what kind of spot were you moving? And if you were moving, how far did you go? Or was it incidental? Did you just happen to see an interesting bird and you just want to record that observation without making a complete checklist of all the birds in the area? So those are some options. And then there are more complicated options below, but those are the main three: traveling, stationary, incidental. So this is a recent track I recorded. I was just in Iceland, as I mentioned, and I was by myself after the end of the tour doing a little walking around, and this is where I went to do some e-birding. And so it's really cool that it records your track and it knows the exact amount of time and distance that you traveled. So quickly to review. So, eBird data generally always includes location, distance, potentially distance if you were moving or recording that, the date, the time, the duration, the species you saw, and perhaps hopefully the numbers of species or numbers of individuals of those species. The observation type, again, that's incidental, traveling, stationary, how many people were with you. And you can also add media, right? I don't do this a whole lot because it does take quite a bit of time and effort. I think it's a great thing to do where you would add photos to particular species you saw or audio recordings. And so that's really a great way to enrich your data. And you can also add comments for the entire checklist as well as for individual species. Okay, so we have our eBird data, and this is being fed into the database. But before it gets sort of crystallized into the database forever and ever, the folks at eBird would like to have an opportunity to ensure some data quality, do a little quality control. So how do they do that? First off, they have what are called filters. This is an automated process. This is basically an algorithm set up that will look at your checklist and assess it and flag anything that's weird. And what it's basically doing is, let me show you an image here. It's looking at the individual species you recorded. And if you put in numbers of species, it's looking at that, and it's looking at the time of year. So this is a filter that would be set up by a regional reviewer. And this is not something that the general public has access to. And this is based upon expert knowledge. And so let's say, well, actually, I'll give you an example in a moment. In fact, here we go. Let's do it this way. So I live in Portland, Oregon, or in the outskirts of Portland, Oregon. I have a lot of birds in my backyard. Now, let's just say I one day think I saw a Temminck's Targapan, a really ridiculous, amazing, alien-looking bird. I'm super excited. I put it into eBird. Well, that's great, but one of those filters is definitely going to catch this and it's going to get flagged. It's going to be flagged because, as far as I know, Temminck's Targapan has never been seen in Oregon, much less North America, probably. So that would be incredibly unlikely in the location and the time of year and all that. So then we'll talk about what happens after an observation gets flagged. But here's another example. This is the varied thrush. The varied thrush is a common bird in Oregon. It's a really, really awesome member of the thrush family, related to robins. I see these birds in my yard quite a bit, but in the winter, let's say I submit an eBird checklist and I say, I saw 42 varied thrushes in my backyard and it's July. Well, guess what? That's going to get flagged because it wouldn't make any sense for that many varied thrushes to be in this location at this time of year in July. So that too would get flagged. So it's not necessarily just rare species. It's even common species if they're in the numbers are wrong or the time of year is wrong. So we have these filters set up. And then the next level of data quality review is regional reviewers. So these are people who volunteer their time and their expertise to look at any flagged data, and they'll get in touch with you and ask you questions about it, maybe ask if you have some photos, some audio recordings, some notes, anything that you can do to verify that crazy thing you saw. Now, of course, what I imagine is that there's some, headquarters where all these reviewers are fast-paced accessing all this data and making phone calls and sending emails. Well, I'm sure that's not at all what's happening. Again, stock photo. But there are real folks out there doing hard work assessing all of this data. So these are some examples of regional reviewers. So Melissa Hafting is a reviewer in British Columbia, Canada. Francesca Albini is a reviewer in the states of Oaxaca and Chiapas, Mexico. eBird has over 2,000 people like this around the world looking at data like this, and this is really an amazing thing for quality control. And so if you ever get contacted by these folks, please be very nice to them because they are working hard to ensure eBird has great data. So that's some quality control. Now, you have all this data, it's in the database. What do the people at eBird do with it? Well, they do a lot of things, but they make some products that are available to us and available to scientists as well. They take that tons of raw data and they produce some interesting things. Excuse me. First off, they make bar charts, which you probably are familiar with, especially if you've gone into the desktop version of eBird. This is a really amazing way of looking at a given location and seeing the seasonal movements of birds, the seasonal presence or absence of birds. So this is Central Park in New York. And we can see some of the members of the Nematodes family, the geese and swans. You can see, for example, that the Canada goose is pretty much in Central Park 24/7 all year. They're always there. Whereas something like the northern shoveler is there in the winter months, but then mostly disappears in the summer and then returns late in the year. So bar charts are really great tools to get a sense of what's going on with bird diversity in a given location. Now, kind of tangential to that there's all different ways of looking at this kind of data. If you use the Merlin app, you can look at what the likely birds are in a given location at a given time of the year. In eBird now, you can explore your local area and see what birds have been seen in various hotspots within a certain radius of your location in the last, say, 3 days or 7 days. So all of this data can be used in interesting ways like that. It's super useful to birders and to researchers. So we've got bar charts, and we also have status and trends. And to me, this is one of the coolest things that the folks at eBird have done with all of this data is they've made these amazing maps. So here is a map for the spotted towhee, which is a common bird in the western part of North America. I've got them in my backyard singing right now. This map is showing the abundance of the spotted towhee during the breeding season. So in June, July, and August. And this is based on eBird data, but it's not the same as showing where people have actually seen the spotted towhee. It's much more sophisticated than that. It's using eBird data, but it's combining that data with some complicated landscape variables, satellite imagery that's relating where people see these birds to the type of habitat and the type of terrain that they're in, and extrapolating that across the landscape. So that's really cool. You get this more continuous map, more realistic map, perhaps, predicting where you should see these towhees. So that's in the breeding season, but they also have data for the rest of the year. So this is again looking at the towhee. Now we have purple for year round. We have red for breeding season. We have blue for the non-breeding season, and yellow for kind of migratory or transitional periods. So this is really an incredible resource. And what they've done with it is take it one step further, and they've produced the 21st century equivalent of a range map. And I imagine we'll be seeing more of this kind of thing in the future with these range maps that are based upon real-time eBird data. So here it's a similar thing, but now we've got this kind of, I don't know how I want to say it, amalgamation of all that data. And yeah, it's a more detailed range map than you would see in something like a field guide. So pretty remarkable. And now these used to just be available for a number of species in the United States and North America. Now this has been, they're extending it to species around the world. Here's the channel-billed cuckoo in Australasia. And we have the Eurasian hoopoe all across, well, Eurasia. And yeah, lots of great stuff is happening there. Hopefully they'll just keep expanding that to cover more and more bird species. So bar charts, status and trends. And then very recently, eBird, the folks at eBird started creating these habitat charts. And this is they have this for about 649 species, I think most of which are North American. And I won't go too deeply into this, but this now is getting even a more kind of fine scale looking at the actual habitat that the birds are using. So this across the x-axis on the bottom, you have the months of the year. And then on the y-axis, you have sort of the likelihood of finding that bird in a particular habitat type. If it's a positive number, then that means you expect to find the bird there. Negative, it's less likely, you're less likely to find the species there. So for the California quail, for example, in September, you have that kind of relatively thick kind of lime green positive bar. That would suggest that at that time of year, California quail are in open forests. That's what that color corresponds to. There's also a thin kind of gold colored line there that would maybe be sparse shrublands. So this is, this data is being used in more and more refined ways to help us understand where birds are and what they're doing and what habitats they're in. It's super, super cool. And then the last product I want to talk about, and again, these things are all free, so they're not really products, I guess, but is the quiz. So this is something I've really enjoyed quite a lot. And if you're not aware, you can go to the eBird website, and there's the photo and sound quiz, which is really great. And you can do it in your browser on your phone as well. I do this sometimes when I'm going to a new destination, or even just a review for a destination that I'm leading a tour in. I just do quizzes, and it's really great because you get to see these photos of birds. You have a multiple choice test or question, and you can test your skills. And so here, for example, we have a hooded warbler from New York City, so that's pretty cool. But some are more easy. Some are a nice photo like that of a bird. But what I think is really cool is you get a lot of really lousy photos like this one, because these are images that people are submitting through eBird to the Macaulay Library, which is associated with the Cornell Lab, which that's the group that manages and runs eBird. So all of these pictures are in there. And so, what's this? Like, well, I don't know. I don't usually recognize birds by their cloaca, but turns out this is a bay-breasted warbler. So if you knew it was a bay-breasted warbler, wow, you're pretty good. And so you can test your skills in less than ideal photographic conditions this way. And eBird is doing this for you as a useful tool, but they're also doing this as a way to improve their database of images, because after you answer the question, you can rate that image on its quality, and they have some guidelines for that. And so that helps them get some crowdsourcing on how to rate their images. Hey, and guess what? You can have eBird in your car. This is this is kind of crazy. In certain models of Subaru in the last few years, they have this kind of computer built into the car, and there are apps, and one of the apps is eBird. And so if you have one of these things, you can pull up, what birds have been seen in the area, and hey, look, there's an American coot that's 10 miles away, and you can navigate to it, and you can step on the gas and fly through all the red lights because you got to see that American coot right now. That's pretty exciting. I think if I'm in the market for another car, I'll take a look at that, but I think it's only in Subarus. Okay, so what kind of questions can a researcher ask and maybe possibly answer using eBird data? Now, excuse me, this is not probably a comprehensive list of research, the types of research questions you can ask, but just to get your kind of brain thinking about this, very obviously, many questions would be related to the spatial distribution of birds, because that's what eBird data is, right? It's where they are and when. And so, it having to do with individual species where they are, as well as groups of species, diversity. And so we have spatial distribution as well as temporal distribution, where they are in time throughout the year. So either seasonally or at larger timescales across decades, perhaps. And where the data has actual counts of individuals, it can be possible to look at population trends. So that's one reason you really want to try to record the numbers of individuals you see, because you can help biologists figure out population trends. So that's pretty cool, whether a particular species is increasing or decreasing, either as range wide or in particular locations. And this is related to spatial distribution and temporal distribution. Researchers can ask questions about migration patterns. Where are birds moving to, and is that changing over time? There's a lot of interesting questions there. And then, of course, we just showed some of the habitat associations, because with high resolution satellite imagery, or maybe even some ground truth, on the ground data, biologists can pair eBird data with habitat data. You can use satellite imagery to, for example, quantify the amount of forest or shrubland or wetland in a particular area and associate that with the presence or absence of birds. And then, very importantly, we can look at the effects of human activity. So, for example, in places where humans have cities or places where there's lots of noise that's generated by people, does that seem to be affecting the distribution of birds in those areas? So there's lots of questions regarding the kind of negative effects of human activity, but also the positive effects of human activity. How are, for example, protected areas, do those seem to make a difference for the diversity of birds? And we'll talk about a study that's related to that in a moment. So anyway, those are just some ideas I had about the types of questions. If we sat here and brainstormed or looked at many of the papers that have been published, we could probably come up with other ways that data can be used. So eBird data is amazing. One of the strengths of it is that there's so much of it, and it's spread across the entire world pretty much. And there's now quite a few years of eBird data. But it does have some limitations. There are some challenges if you're going to use eBird data as a researcher. And I want to talk about those for a couple minutes. So first off, there's a taxonomic bias. People are recording these things, right? Many of the people are non-specialists. They're amateurs. They're out there just having a good time birding, and they like certain species more than others. It's just a human nature, right? And they're maybe less interested in something like an invasive species, here in North America, we have European starlings. Maybe you're not so excited about every starling you see or every American crow. So maybe those get ignored sometimes. So there's definite taxonomic biases, and there's ways of getting around that, of course. Spatial bias. So I tend to submit more bird checklists in my local area, in my backyard, in my local birding hotspots. It's very concentrated. And if you look at the globe, the observations are biased that way. So there's lots and lots of observations in the United States, in Canada, in Western Europe, in Australia, New Zealand, India, and less concentrated in other places. So that's a spatial bias. You also see spatial bias in cities and green spaces in cities. There tend to be more observations, Also along major highways, there are more observations, all for very obvious reasons, but those are biases. If you were trying to correct for that, you would lay a grid across the planet of, at some scale, every kilometer, and you'd have a point at every kilometer, and everybody would bird all of those equally, but that's never probably going to happen. So spatial bias is a thing. Temporal bias. Similarly, people tend to be out more so on the weekends. They tend to do more birding in spring, that kind of thing. So there are, observations are concentrated in time as well as space. And so there's that bias. Spatial precision can be a problem. Most checklists have a single GPS point for which they were recorded, but was somebody actually only sitting at that point for that amount of time, or were they moving around in the area? There's some kind of fuzziness to the spatial precision that, if you're a researcher, you need to account for that ideally. There's variation in detectability. Not all birds are equally findable by everyone. That detectability can vary when the weather is different, right? If it's, if the weather's kind of rough, it's raining, maybe birds are less easily observable, and so they don't make it onto the checklist. There's a lot of variability there. Variability in effort. So this, like, for example, someone could go out and do some very, very casual birding and, note a number of interesting species and submit their checklist, but another person on that same day could go to that same place and bird the heck out of it with, extreme vigor and pull out quite a few more species. So, are those checklists equivalent? Probably not. There's variation in effort. And then we have variation in observer skill. This is kind of a similar idea, right? There are people who are crack birders that, can identify every species at a location just by its sound, by their calls. Other people are brand new birders and they're excited to use eBird, and their checklist might look quite different from the former person's checklist. So those are all things that have to be dealt with, or ideally would be dealt with. And, a couple ways to deal with that. How do researchers address the challenges? Well, first of all, the team at eBird tries to encourage robust data collection in the first place. That's your best hope initially, is to get people to record the best possible data. We'll be talking about that at the end of the webinar here, how you can do that. Then we have filters, right? We talked about filters. So this is an automated way to hopefully catch some errors and things that might otherwise squeak through. And then once you get to the analytical side, if you're a researcher, at this point, you do your best to account for any known variability in the data and any biases that you know exist or expect might exist, and you incorporate that into your statistical models. And that can get very complicated very quickly. It's not something I'm an expert in. Years ago when I was doing all the science and doing my own analyses, I was had more of that stuff in my brain. But in any case, it's what modern biologists have to contend with. Okay, so imagine all of that data has been submitted, it has been filtered and reviewed and processed, and now you've got your massive database, and now you're a researcher and you're going to make use of that. And I want to give you now some interesting examples that I have cherry picked from the list of 2020 publications using eBird data. If you go to the eBird website and you click on the link having to do with science up at the top, you can find a list of all of the known publications that have used eBird data. And there are quite a few of them. For example, in 2020, there were 93 peer-reviewed publications that were listed there. So this is just again, I'm just cherry picking a few what I think are interesting examples. Okay, so don't get overwhelmed by all the stuff going on here on screen. The main thing is just look at that title there: Effectiveness of Protected Areas in Conserving Tropical Forest Birds. So this study was looking at a handful of these tropical biodiversity hotspots, and where there were protected areas within those hotspots, the authors wanted to see if the protected areas had greater bird diversity overall. And also they looked at diversity in a couple different more kind of fine scale ways. So they used the massive amount of eBird data across the world for these locations, and they had some interesting conclusions. What they figured out was that maybe surprisingly, bird diversity within these protected areas in these biodiversity hotspots, there was not more overall bird diversity in the protected areas versus outside of the protected areas. So that was kind of, kind of a troubling result. Why aren't there more bird species being protected by these areas? Well, what they did find though was a little more encouraging, was that, yeah, sure, there weren't necessarily more bird species within the protected areas, but the protected areas did harbor and protect more forest dependent birds, because by and large, these are tropical forests we're looking at. So the protected areas did matter for forest dependent birds. They were also helpful for threatened and endangered species, species of concern, as well as birds that were endemic to those particular biodiversity hotspots. So even though overall diversity wasn't much better, these groups were better off within the protected areas than without. And so there's a great example of a conservation application at a global scale using eBird data. Imagine trying to make those kinds of assessments if eBird didn't exist. How would you do it? I mean, you could have hundreds of people over decades collecting data on the ground, possibly, but that would cost many millions of dollars, and it wouldn't be something that probably anybody would get funding for, unless maybe they were the National Science Foundation or National Geographic or something. In any case, eBird data to the rescue, which is pretty cool. Study number 2. Area is the primary correlate of annual and seasonal patterns of avian species richness in urban green spaces. So it says it all, right? That's one of those super long titles, and it basically tells you, it's got the spoiler alert built in. So this is in New York City, in the United States, and what the researchers here were looking at was all of the urban green spaces. So let me show you, zoom in on this figure. So you have on the left there, all of the parks, right? Basically from Central Park and all the other protected areas that have some trees and grass and vegetation that could be of interest to birds. And then what the researchers did was combine that information with eBird data, and they looked at the importance of area, right? The spatial extent of a given urban green space. That was one variable they looked at. They also looked at the shape of those green spaces. Are they kind of more, kind of square, or are they more elongated and skinny? That can matter sometimes in the diversity of an isolated patch. And isolation itself was something that the researchers looked at. They thought maybe, well, if there's a really isolated patch, perhaps that would have fewer species. Interestingly, what they found was that the only thing that seemed to matter was area, that the larger the area, the more species you tend to find. You see that little bar on the bottom there, blue being the least number of species, yellow being the greatest number of species. And the correlation is stronger for, or is strong for, large patches of green space like Central Park harboring more species. So that's a nice finding. And then isolation and shape didn't really matter. So if you were designing a new urban green space, you would, based upon this study alone, you would probably want to design the biggest one you possibly could, and you wouldn't worry as much about how isolated or what shape it is. The third study, another really long title, New Insights into the Patterns and Drivers of Avian Altitudinal Migration from a Growing Crowdsourcing Data Source. That, of course, being eBird. So this is in Taiwan. This study was conducted on the main island of Taiwan. And you see there in that figure on the left, you have basically the elevation map of the island. And then you have the observations, where the observations are concentrated in both the breeding season and the non-breeding season. And so what these researchers were interested in was using eBird, they could look at many different species on the island, on this island in Taiwan, to see where they're going in terms of elevation throughout the year. And this is interesting because many of us are aware of migration on a sort of latitudinal basis, right? Species moving north and south over the year, but there's also altitudinal migration. And you may be familiar with this, but that varied thrush that I showed earlier, that species that I see in the winter in my backyard. Well, I see it in the winter because those birds come down out of the mountains when there's lots of snow in the mountains in the winter. But in the summer, after the snow melts, varied thrushes all move up into the forests and the mountains, and that tends to be where they breed. So that is an altitudinal migrant. So they're looking at that phenomenon on this island in Taiwan using eBird data. So here is a very busy figure. And again, this is none of this is meant for you to look at any major detail, but the gist of this is that for the 60 or so species that they assessed, they found that most of them in the non-breeding season, the winter, they tended to move down slope down to lower elevations. And that's kind of intuitive, right? It's colder in the winter or the non-breeding season at higher elevations, so those species move down. So they had 42 species that moved downhill in winter. But interestingly, some species move uphill in winter. 14 of those species actually moved uphill. Now, these patterns are significant and they're measurable and detectable using eBird data and all the data in this study. What is more challenging is explaining, for example, why those 14 species move uphill in winter. What are they doing? Is there some resource that they can get in winter that they can't get in the summer? That would be one of those things where it's like, further study is needed. That's where you end the paper with that so that you can justify more funding and carry on with your research. So anyway, just pretty cool use of eBird, looking at a more fine scale movement in moving up and down in elevation rather than, north, south, east, west, that kind of thing. The fourth study is titled Birds Rarely Hybridize, which is a bold statement. Birds rarely hybridize, a citizen science approach to estimating rates of hybridization in the wild. So this one was pretty cool. The authors here had an interesting idea, and what they did was they took eBird data from January or from 2010 to 2018, and they looked at all of the observations where there was a hybrid bird that was recorded on a particular checklist, and they wanted to see what was the overall rate of hybridization for birds in the United States across that time period. And they could do this because when a hybrid is recorded on an eBird checklist, there's a lot of quality control that goes into that. The reviewers, those regional reviewers get involved. They want to see pictures. They want to see documentation. It takes a lot for a hybrid bird to be recorded permanently in the eBird database. So right away, that there's a quality control there. And so these researchers looked at that, and what they found was that there is a pretty low rate of hybridization overall. So if you include all hybrids, what they found was that there were about 0.064% hybrids relative to all the other birds across that time period of almost 20 years, or actually, pardon me, of 8 years. So that's pretty low. But what they also found was there were several species that were far and away documented more often as hybrids or being part of a hybrid group. So mallard ducks, all right, the mallard hybridizes a lot with other duck species, and the glaucous winged gull, that bird also hybridizes with a bunch of other gulls. So those hybrids kind of were drastically biasing that hybrid data set. So when they took out those birds, they found that actually those and then the 10 most influential hybrid species, they got them out of the data set. And then the overall rate of hybridization dropped to 0.009%. So very, very low. And so that's why they felt they could make this bold statement of birds rarely hybridize. Now, is that true across the world and everywhere? Maybe not, but it is a catchy title. So that, I think, is a really great way to use eBird data, a pretty novel approach. Okay, the last study I want to talk about is ecological and geographical overlap drive plumage evolution and mimicry in woodpeckers. Now, I don't know about you, but I think woodpeckers are super cool. They're one of my favorite types of bird. And so I really enjoyed this study. And what they're doing is they're using images of birds from the what formerly the Handbook of Birds of the World, now is included in the Birds of the World, which is an online resource that I highly recommend. They use these images, the paintings of the birds, to quantify the colors and the patterns of the woodpecker plumage, and they're finding correlations with those patterns and colors, with the amount of seasonality and the habitat type across, I think, the whole world, actually, even though this image is just showing the Western Hemisphere. So they're finding those patterns and correlations with habitat and with the seasonality, but they're also looking at, well, how much does it matter the way a woodpecker looks? How much does its ancestry matter, like who it's related to, versus how much does its habitat matter, and that sort of thing. And what they found some interesting patterns that there is a strong correlation of these birds having particular types of plumages in particular habitats. So for example, if you look at this figure here, you've got the hairy and the downy woodpecker at the top right there. They are in North America where there's a high degree of seasonality and they have this kind of black and white plumage. Woodpeckers that tend to be in more tropical places tend to have more of this kind of brown plumage like the ones you see on the bottom there. And the rest of this figure, basically the take home message here is that the birds that are most closely related to each other, like that has less to do with the habitat and the location in terms of seasonality, because we know that downy and hairy woodpeckers are not each other's closest relatives. They look very similar, and that we think, biologists think, is actually due to mimicry. That maybe the idea here is that the downy woodpecker looks like the hairy woodpecker because the hairy woodpecker is more dominant against other bird species. And if the downy can look like a hairy woodpecker, then it can, kind of scare off other birds that it might not otherwise be able to because it's a smaller, more diminutive species. And that phenomenon of mimicry is going on in other woodpeckers that are unrelated around the world. So this study used all of this amazing eBird data and the locations of these woodpeckers combined with an analysis of their plumage and brought that all together in this really interesting way. Now, this figure just makes my heart happy. I don't know exactly all what's going on here, but I love it because you see on the right there, especially all of these images, all of the illustrations of the different woodpeckers. And this is a principal components analysis kind of showing the degrees of difference, kind of the extremes in plumage for woodpeckers in this data set. And you see on the left there in purple, you've got the woodpecker that's basically all black, and then you have the red-headed woodpecker at the bottom. Anyway, just super cool. Again, I don't know all what's going on. It's basically the way they're analyzing the colors and the patterns, but this looks like a really awesome study to have been a part of. Makes me wish I was still in academia a little bit. Okay, so again, those were just some examples of things I thought were cool. You can comb through the literature and find many other examples of eBird data being used in creative ways. So how can you contribute to these kinds of studies? How can you make sure the eBird checklists you're submitting are of the highest quality? Let's talk about that for a few minutes as we wrap things up here. And so you want to make sure that you get the thumbs up from the buffed wing star frontlet here, so you submit some good data. Okay, so first of all, one of the best ways you can increase the value of your checklist is by making it complete. So rather than say submitting an incidental checklist, try to see all the birds in that particular area and have it be complete. Also try to record the actual numbers of individuals you saw rather than just saying, yeah, presence or absence. And if you submit a complete checklist, one of the reasons that's so valuable is because it also tells researchers what species were not there. Which ones did you not observe? Because if you're saying, these are all the birds I saw, and I actually tried to find all the birds, then that's important information, because maybe there's a species in that location that is seen at other times of year or by other observers, and you didn't see it. But if you do an incidental checklist or something like that, then it's unclear whether or not that's the case. Again, the example being European starlings. If I'm out birding and I'm all excited to see all these other species, but yeah, sure, there were some starlings. I mean, I don't know about you, but sometimes these invasive species like starlings, I almost have like a mental filter where like I just almost don't even see them because I'm like, it's just a starling, who cares? But for science, it matters. Those birds are in that habitat. They are possibly competing with other species. They have an effect. So don't ignore those common species or those, invasive introduced species. They're all important. Every bird is important. Another thing you can do is know when to start a new list, right? Because if you take this to an extreme, you could be like, yeah, I took a trip to Mexico and I have one list for the entire country of all the birds I saw over the course of 2 weeks. You know, that's a list, but that you probably should have had multiple lists on that trip. So it's good to know when to start a new list. So first of all, start a new list when you change birding locations. I mean, and forgive me because probably a lot of these things are things you already do, but it's just good to just go over these things. So if you move, you know, a little ways away, a different habitat, then definitely start a new list. And again, major habitat types, right? If you're in a forest doing some birding and now you move out into an open meadow type habitat, probably a good idea to start a new checklist there. If you change the type of birding you're doing, so let's say you're doing a sea watch, you know, you've got your scope and you're standing out on a dock or something or at the coast, looking at all the birds out over the ocean, and that was stationary, right? You're there for an hour, but then you start walking along the beach, and now you're birding, looking for shorebirds. That would be traveling, different type of observation. So a good idea to start a new checklist at that point. If you've been stationary for more than an hour, the folks at eBird recommend that you start a new checklist. And I'm guilty of this sometimes. You know, I've done some birding like in my yard or something for maybe over the course of 2 or 3 hours, and then submitted that as a single checklist. So, you know, what the team at eBird is asking for is basically a finer scale resolution in both space and time. So start a new list if you've been there for more than an hour, and likewise, start a new list if you've been traveling for more than a mile. That would be best practices. You'll see some recommendations of starting or keeping checklists within 5 miles, but really, if you want to do it right, you want to start a new checklist for every mile. And you want to choose an accurate location, right? This can be tricky sometimes, but you know, your phone probably knows exactly where you were when you started your eBird checklist, and you have to use a little discretion. Do you keep that exact location, or should you choose the nearest hotspot? If, let's say, you're at a particular lake and or a pond, and that is a known hotspot, and you're standing at the edge of it, it's probably okay to select the hotspot for the center of that lake. It captures that entire area versus your own personal location there. It's not the end of the world if you keep your personal location, because researchers can use analyses to kind of pool together local observations into a single spot. So that, you know, it's not the end of the world, but just something to think about. And this is the idea of this, you know, submitting a complete checklist. So rather than doing an incidental checklist, if you're out there and you think you're going to do an eBird checklist, stop, look, you know, see what birds there are in the area, whether they're common or not, all the birds you can possibly find. Listen, you know, if you're able to bird by ear, that's great. Try to identify birds by ear. That can often be, you know, can yield many more species that way sometimes than by sight. So it's a great skill to develop. And then count, provide counts. Even if those counts are not exact, there are ways, there are you know, techniques to estimating numbers of birds, especially when they're in large numbers. But you know, it's better to say that you think there were, you know, 100 of whatever species, rather than just, yeah, that species was there, because that could be one or that could be 5,000. Nobody knows. So it's better to put 100, just ballpark it if you have to. And then use mobile tracks. Again, the app is trying to get you to do this as much as possible. If you've got your phone with you and you're using eBird, just let it record the track that you're walking so that it'll have the exact route, the distance, the time, all of that information will be nicely available. And then document your sightings. Again, this is something that I need to be better about. You know, it's if you have photos of those birds, that's super valuable to submit with your checklist. And you can do this later on, right? You can submit a checklist on your phone, and then you can come back, you know, even weeks later, months later, and add photos to your checklists. I have done that to an extent. And also you can add comments and you can add audio recordings. All of that is really, really helpful data that will be useful in the future for researchers and for yourself. You can go back and you can see, you know, photos that you took on a particular place and time, particular birds. That's super cool. This is specific to birding in a group. So let's say you're birding in a group and there are 5 people and everybody is an eBird user, and they all want to make sure that they have that information, you know, on their list, their life list or whatever. The best way to do this is rather than have everybody keep track of their own eBird observations, let one person be the eBirder of the day. They record it and for the group, and then they share that list with everybody in the group. And then once you have that checklist in your eBird account, you can go through and annotate it. Let's say, oh, I didn't see that great skua when we were walking around in Iceland that one day. Then you don't want it to be on your life list. Let's say you don't want it to be in your eBird. You can just delete that. You can take it out of there. So there's ways of fixing up your checklists and making them accurate. So that's a few things you can do. I also want to read you this quote from regional reviewer Francesca Albini. She's the current featured reviewer on the eBird website. What she says is for improving your checklist, she says, if possible, try to be aware of limits of distribution and seasonality of the species you are entering. When in doubt, check available resources first. So that would be like, that Temix Targapan I thought I saw in my backyard. Well, if I just looked at my field guide, I'd probably realize that's not even possible. She goes on to say, avoid using imprecise locations. Add documentation, especially media, when possible, even for records that were not flagged. This will facilitate assessing records and ultimately improve our knowledge on local bird species. So that's just some advice from a reviewer that deals with this stuff all day, every day. Well, that, my folks, my friends, is the end of my webinar for you. Let me see, I'll start my little video up here. And I will just briefly mention again the ways you can connect with me if you're interested. If you would, if you are hip to podcasts and you like that sort of thing, you can check out scienceofbirds.com. That's one way you can listen to the podcast. You can also find that basically everywhere you find podcasts for the most part, like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, that sort of thing. And then you can check out wildlatitudes.com. That's my tour business if you want to see what I'm up to there in the coming year. And with that, I say thank you, and I would be happy to field any questions you may have. And there's my email address if you want to get in touch with me.
Ivan, thank you. Hereward, I before this presentation, I was out, and then I got back maybe just about a few minutes before, and I went and I had a piece of toast, and I was supposed to go and get a glass of water, but your presentation was so riveting. Apart from the amazing photography, which are all yours, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yeah, all of the main pictures you see in the background were all mine. Yeah.
Yeah, excellent. So I just want to make sure everyone knows that. But overall, it was such a interesting presentation that I couldn't even leave to get myself a glass of water. So I'm still on, like, probably have bits of toast stuck in my throat.
Right. You're dehydrated now.
Yeah. But I am my mind is well watered. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for us.
Yeah, I learned a number of things. Not the least of which is because we've been home in lockdown, we've been having to do some like home birding, bird from home, great backyard bird count, and so on. And what I used to do all the time, I would always start a list, and because I wasn't going anywhere, I would just keep that list open sometimes for the entire day. And I probably drove some of these eBird people nuts by doing that.
Yeah, I'm guilty too. Like I said, I've done that too. And so, I mean, I certainly learned some things. I mean, this was a great exercise for me too, because it helped me remind myself of the best practices. So hopefully all of us, maybe got a few tips in that regard.
Wonderful. Okay, so let me just check the chat and send some questions your way. So I have one here. How does in the recent increase, how does the recent increase in checklists and observations translate to the announcement that bird populations are in serious decline? Is it conceivable that more data than, say, 5 years ago skews this conclusion?
Yeah, if I understand the question correctly, that if we're seeing this increase in eBird participation, is that at all a response to the decline in species? Is that kind of the idea? Like people are maybe more interested, or is that your interpretation for us?
Yeah, I'm thinking that Well, I would assume that if there are more observations, then that would probably indicate the converse, that bird populations are not in serious decline if there are more observations. But I'm not sure. David, I don't know if you would like to clarify some part of this question, please. You can say that in the chat or wherever. Okay, I'm just going to move on to another. We'll
Yeah.
come back to that.
Okay.
This is a comment from Lancy, who's going to be talking here in a couple of weeks. Language is another bias. Bird names are only available in English and Latin. More checklists are submitted by English-speaking birders and from English-speaking countries. As an expedition guide, I found it difficult to encourage non-English speaking guests to participate. Hope eBird would have more language options of bird names in near future.
Yeah, that's an interesting comment. That's a really, really good point. You know, it's not something I've really encountered myself being an English speaker. So, you know, that's really interesting. You know, we do see these geographic biases, and probably there are a lot of factors there, you know, socioeconomic factors, cultural factors, but also language factors. Absolutely. And I'm sure that the folks at eBird are thinking about how to improve that. But yeah, I'm not sure what the current state is.
Yeah, because I remember when you shared the map, you know, all the observations are really concentrated in certain areas, which happen to be English speaking areas. And it didn't even click to me that that's the reason.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Interestingly, I mean, the one exception I would say is in India. That's one of the kind of hotspots of eBird observations. Now, whether or not those folks are, you know, English speakers and they're using the tools in English or not, you know, that's an interesting question.
Definitely something to look at in the future. Okay, so another one. How much does the difficulty of registering a bona fide hybrid on eBird impact the perception of abundance of hybrids in the wild? As in, not all observers may be able to get a good enough photo to include the observation or be able to describe the bird properly and noting key characteristics and so on.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting question because, you know, detecting hybrids is a challenge. I mean, sometimes there may not even be very noticeable physical traits that we can capture, but when there are, yeah, that there's all these levels of challenge to get to the point where there's a verified observation. So it's probably, you know, certainly underestimating the actual amount of hybridization out there. So that's why, you know, I kind of just, you know, joked a little bit about that title that, you know, hybridization is rare. It's, you know, that's a title that might help, you know, get a paper published, but, you know, there's probably more hybridization going on. It's very complex. So yeah, I think, you know, it's hard to say how many we're missing, right? We know how many we can probably verify, but how do you confirm the ones you haven't caught?
Yeah, exactly. Because I mean, like here in Trinidad, we've had reports of, let's just say, tricolored herons and little blue, or little blue and snowy egrets. And sometimes, you know, like if someone is reporting this and they just say, well, there was an odd plumaged egret. It looked like a little blue. It looked like a snowy or whatever, but it had some plumes, or, you know, like for the reviewer, looking at that, they're like, well, is it just an aberrantly plumaged snowy egret? You know, like they have all these other questions that would come into play before even considering a hybrid.
Yeah,
So
absolutely. Yeah, I honestly, I mean, even though I have a background in, you know, population genetics and all that, hybrids, I would be very hesitant to call something a hybrid. I mean, at best, if you suspect it's one, take as many pictures as you can. That would be ideal. You know, but to me, it seems like a little bit of voodoo trying to, you know, say, oh, well, this is definitely a cross between these two species, you know, without actual
without,
genetic
yeah,
evidence.
genetic analysis, exactly. Yeah, there was a hummingbird that came up here some time ago, a few years, and some people were insisting it was a new species. But it turns out that it very possibly may have been a hybrid. And to think of hybridization on that level up with hummingbirds, it's kind of mind blowing, you know, in terms of identification.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's crazy.
Yeah. Okay, so David is clarifying here. what I'm asking is to do more reports correlate to conclusions on bird population health that may be skewed simply by more data from a higher number of observations and checklists. In other words, things may not be as bad as certain research suggests.
Yeah. Again, if I understand what you're saying, that I mean, I feel like it'd be the opposite, right? If we have more observations, we should theoretically be detecting more birds, and that would show a biased, increase in species. But I guess, getting at the basic question, yes. I mean, when you have this temporal trend where you have more species and more participation being taking place in more recent years, that is absolutely going to affect the way you look at your long-term trends. And so any of these biologists who are publishing papers using eBird data and making these kind of large statements about bird trends, they're going to have pretty sophisticated statistical analyses incorporating that change, that increase in frequency of checklists and things like that. So how they exactly do that, I don't know, but you'd have to look into their methods, and you can question them, but if it's in a good peer-reviewed journal, then probably that analysis already went through the gauntlet and made it out the other side. And so I tend to trust that if it's a reputable publication. But that's, anyway, just some thoughts about that.
Great. Yeah, another question. Can an eBird list be shared if it is recorded in one language, but my eBird record is in another language? We went birding in Costa Rica with a guide. He was not able to send me a usable list.
Oh no, that's interesting. Yeah, I like I said, I don't have a lot of experience with that. That's interesting. I feel like I've had local guides in Latin American countries share their lists, but yeah, I'll have to look into that. That seems like that would be a major limitation that needs to be worked on. Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, that's interesting. Ties in with the other comment on languages, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. Great presentation. Thank you. Most interesting, insightful. A lot of good words coming your way, Ivan.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah. Great presentation. Another cool feature of eBird for your own records is being able to create historical checklists.
Yeah, it's not something I've done. I was recently looking into, I have, at least for my life list, if nothing else, I have, birds I know I saw, and I could probably even figure out the date and time, like in Australia or something, for example, that I could go back and do. But yeah, so yeah, I mean, the eBird data extends back, decades, because of historical records that people have gone back and put those checklists in. Often modern research will filter those out for various reasons because maybe they aren't quite as reliable or not as rich, but still that data is there, and that's pretty cool.
It is, definitely. Regarding new birders, and let's just say novice birders who may not be as confident with their ID as some other more experienced birders would be, do you have any tips for them in terms of using eBird and their confidence in using eBird?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, isn't it? And that's going to be something that's very common, is that, people who are these days who are new birders probably very quickly are going to discover eBird and want to start using it right away. I think that's great. I don't work for the folks at eBird, so I don't know what their advice would be. Maybe I could see somebody saying, well, maybe wait till your skills are a little better before you start eBirding. But, I would tend to think that it would be fine to do your best. Because the question that's asked in the app is basically, after you've done your checklist, it's like, are these all the birds you were able to identify? Basically and that's based upon your own skill and knowledge.
Yeah.
And so, I think there's ways of researchers quantifying, like, for example, let's say there's a hot spot where lots of people go birding and they're recording their observations. And let's say you are a novice birder and you go there and you see 5 species, whereas the average person there sees 25 species. There might be ways statistically to account for the variability in skill, if you will, there. So I would say just, do your best. Obviously try to build your skills. You can try the eBird quiz. Merlin is a great tool. There's a lot of we live in a time with amazing tools for learning about your local birds or any birds anywhere. So I just say, yeah, do your best and try to get those numbers. You know, that's helpful. Any data is better than no data.
Oh yeah, 100%. Okay. Well, I'm not sure if anyone has any other questions. I think we've um, covered everything. Yeah, I don't think there's anything else, unless
Great.
anyone has any last minute questions. But yeah, Ivan, I thoroughly always enjoy listening to you. I listen to your podcast. And if anyone else is thinking about it, even if you don't always listen to podcasts, once you like birds, do check out the Science of Birds. It's going to be it's always entertaining and informative, because yeah, Ivan, you tend to slip in a few jokes here and there when you're least expecting it, and they always catch me off guard.
That's what I'm doing, trying to keep you on your toes for us.
Yeah, yeah, and I appreciate good humor always. So yeah, I enjoy it. Birds, good humor, excellent information, highly recommended.
Thank you. Thank
Okay.
you. Well, this has been great. Thank you so much, Faraz, again for the opportunity. And Derek, you guys are doing great stuff here. I hope everybody checks out more webinars and checks out your master classes, all of the things. And, you know, hopefully I'll see you folks around somewhere at some time down the road. And happy birding, everyone.
Oh yeah, definitely. Well, take care everyone, and it was really nice. And until we meet again. Cheers, guys. Take care.
Cheers. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.